got no idea how long I'm going to keep that airplane in the sky.
Debbie McKelvey feels the plane's erratic motion and fears for her life.
Throughout aviation history, there have been moments that defy the odds, times when pilots, flight crews, and passengers overcame impossible situations with sheer determination, skill, and courage. Today, we're diving into some of the most unbelievable and miraculous stories of survival in the sky. From miraculous emergency landings to heroic acts under extreme pressure, these incidents are true testaments to the resilience of the human spirit. Stay tuned as we explore the incredible feats of bravery that have made these flights unforgettable. This is aviation's greatest rescues. Miracle on the Hudson, U.S. Airways, Flight 1549. On January 15, 2009, U.S. Airways Flight 1549 took off from LaGuardia Airport in New York, bound for Charlotte. Just minutes after takeoff, as the Airbus A320 climbed to 2,800 feet, it encountered a catastrophic event, a bird strike.
Birds.
And they were very, very close, too close for us to maneuver around.
Whoa!
A large flock of Canada geese collided with the aircraft, causing a dual-engine failure and leaving the plane with no thrust. Captain Chesley, Sully Sullenberger, and First Officer Jeff Skiles had only seconds to react. With no power and no nearby airports within reach, they had to make a split-second decision. After quickly assessing their options, Sully decided to attempt an emergency water landing on the Hudson River, an almost impossible feat. With thousands of people watching in shock, Sully executed a flawless ditching maneuver, keeping the plane intact as it glided onto the water. Passengers scrambled onto the wings as the icy river began to swallow the aircraft. Within minutes, ferry boats, first responders, and rescue crews arrived, saving all 155 people on board. The entire world hailed Sully as a hero, and the event became one of the greatest aviation rescues in history. A true miracle on the Hudson. The Gimli glider, Air Canada, Flight 143. On July 23, 1983, Air Canada Flight 143 was cruising at 41,000 feet when disaster struck. Both engines suddenly shut down mid-flight. The cause? A fuel miscalculation, triggered by Air Canada's recent switch from imperial to metric measurements, meant the aircraft ran out of fuel halfway to its destination. With zero thrust and no power, Captain Bob Pearson and First Officer Maurice Quintal had just seconds to react. Instead of panicking, Pearson relied on his glider pilot experience to steer the massive Boeing 767 toward an abandoned airstrip in Gimli, Manitoba. But there was a huge problem. The former airfield had been converted into a racetrack, and spectators were gathered on the runway. With no second chances, Pearson executed a flawless dead-stick landing, avoiding the crowd and bringing the aircraft to a stop just short of disaster.
"17 minutes after running out of fuel, Air Canada Flight 143 comes to a final stop on the ground.
The landing was so smooth that the aircraft was later repaired and returned to service, forever earning its place as one of the most legendary emergency landings in aviation history, and the plane itself became known as the Gimli glider. British Airways Flight 5390, the pilot who got sucked out. On June 10, 1990, British Airways Flight 5390 was cruising at 17,300 feet when disaster struck. In a freak accident, the cockpit windshield suddenly shattered, causing an explosive decompression. The force was so powerful that Captain Timothy Lancaster was ripped from his seat and sucked halfway out of the aircraft, his body pinned against the fuselage at 400 miles per hour winds, with only his legs still inside the cockpit. Thinking he was already dead, the terrified flight attendants lunged for his ankles, refusing to let go as the freezing wind howled through the cabin. Meanwhile, First Officer Alistair Atchison took control, manually flying the BAC-111 toward an emergency landing. With no autopilot and barely any visibility, he guided the aircraft safely to the ground. Against all odds, Lancaster survived, suffering only minor injuries despite spending over 20 minutes pinned outside the plane. His crew's quick thinking and determination turned what should have been a fatal accident into one of the most astonishing in-flight rescues in aviation history. The ghost plane, Helios Airways Flight 522. On August 14, 2005, Helios Airways Flight 522 became the flight that flew itself, with an unconscious crew and passengers. A pressurization system failure caused hypoxia, silently depriving everyone on board of oxygen as the Boeing 737 climbed to 34,000 feet. For over 2 hours, the aircraft continued flying on autopilot, completely unresponsive. Greek fighter jets were scrambled to intercept, and what they saw was chilling. Oxygen masks dangling, passengers motionless, and no signs of life. But then they spotted something shocking. One man was still moving.
Athena Control, there is one person moving in the cockpit of Helios 522. Repeat, there is one person inside the cockpit.
Andreas Prodromou, a flight attendant with pilot training, had remained conscious and was desperately trying to take control of the aircraft. With his last ounces of strength, he made his way to the cockpit, attempting to save the plane. But just as he reached the controls, the engines flamed out from fuel exhaustion. Moments later, the aircraft crashed into a hillside, leaving no survivors. Though the tragedy could not be stopped, Prodromou's bravery in those final moments remains legendary, making this one of the most haunting aviation disasters in history. China Airlines Flight 006, the 747, that fell 30,000 feet. On February 19, 1985, China Airlines Flight 006 was cruising at 41,000 feet when disaster struck. A minor engine failure should have been manageable, but an autopilot issue sent the Boeing 747 into a terrifying nosedive. As the aircraft plunged 30,000 feet in just 2 minutes, the extreme G-forces caused passengers to black out, and the airframe was pushed to its limits. The wings nearly ripped apart under the stress, and the crew fought desperately to regain control. With only 9,000 feet left before impact, Captain Min Yuan-ho managed to manually pull the aircraft out of the dive, saving everyone on board. The plane was badly damaged, but the crew held it together and safely landed in San Francisco. Against all odds, every passenger survived, making this one of the most miraculous recoveries in aviation history. United Airlines Flight 232, no controls, no problem. On July 19, 1989, United Airlines Flight 232 was cruising at 37,000 feet when a catastrophic engine explosion sent shockwaves through the aircraft. The blast severed hydraulic lines, causing total flight control failure. The pilots couldn't steer, climb, or descend. With no conventional controls, Captain Al Haynes and his crew improvised a never-before-attempted technique, using throttle adjustments on the remaining engines to guide the plane. Against all odds, they aimed for Sioux City, Iowa, struggling to keep the crippled DC-10 in the air. As they approached the runway, the plane came in too fast, and the descent was uncontrollable. Upon landing, the aircraft cartwheeled, broke apart, and burst into flames. Yet, in what seemed impossible, 185 of the 296 people survived, a testament to the incredible skill and teamwork of the flight crew, making this one of the most remarkable crash landings in aviation history. Ethiopian Airlines Flight 961, the plane that ditched in the ocean. On November 23, 1996, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 961 was hijacked by 3 armed men who forced the aircraft to keep flying until it ran out of fuel. With no options left, Captain Lulabat made the harrowing decision to attempt an emergency water landing in the Indian Ocean. one of the most dangerous maneuvers a pilot can perform. Despite the strong ocean currents and high stakes, Abate aimed to land as close to a beach as possible. However, as the plane touched the water, it hit a wave and broke apart on impact. In the chaos that followed, 50 passengers survived, making this one of the few successful ditchings in aviation history. Though the odds were overwhelmingly against them, the crew's quick thinking and the captain's calm under pressure ensured that many lives were saved. The Phoenix Flight. Air Transat Flight 236. On August 24, 2001, Air Transat Flight 236 was en route from Toronto to Lisbon when disaster struck. The A330's fuel system failed during the flight, and the aircraft lost all power in both engines. With no functioning engines and a glide ratio that wouldn't make it to any airport, Captain Robert Pichet and First Officer Dirk de Jager were faced with an impossible situation. Pichet, a seasoned glider pilot, skillfully glided the aircraft for 120 miles, over 200 kilometers, toward the Azores, managing to keep the plane's descent rate steady. As they approached the island of Terceira, the crew executed a perfect emergency landing, barely touching the runway and stopping just before the end. Miraculously, despite being out of fuel for nearly 40 minutes, all 306 passengers and crew survived the harrowing ordeal. Captain Pichet's calm, cool-headed decision-making made this one of the most impressive rescues in aviation history. The unbelievable escape, Qantas Flight 32, on November 4, 2010. Qantas Flight 32 departed Singapore Changi Airport heading to Sydney when the unthinkable occurred. At cruising altitude, an uncontained engine failure led to a massive explosion in the number 2 engine on the Airbus A380. Shrapnel from the explosion caused significant damage to the aircraft, affecting several key flight systems. The flight crew, led by Captain Richard de Crespigny, immediately realized that their aircraft was dangerously crippled, but they kept a cool head and methodically dealt with the emergency. The team had to reroute and communicate constantly with the ground to manage the increasingly severe failures. They were forced to jettison fuel to lighten the plane for landing. After an intense 2 hours of high-stress flying, the crew successfully brought the A380 down at Sydney Airport, where emergency teams were ready. Every single person aboard, 469 in total, survived. The Desert Miracle, Air India Flight 182. On June 23, 1985, Air India Flight 182 took off from Toronto, bound for New Delhi. While in mid-flight, a bomb exploded in the cargo hold, causing the plane to disintegrate mid-air over the Atlantic Ocean, leaving wreckage scattered across thousands of square miles. However, there was a faint signal from a surviving piece of wreckage, which was later traced. The search and rescue operations were intense, but for days, the wreckage was submerged. Miraculously, a small group of survivors were found floating in the waters near the wreck. Among them was Captain Chandan Singh, who was able to survive despite grave injuries. Though not every passenger survived, the rescue efforts and determination of the team to recover the wreckage from a seemingly hopeless situation were praised globally. It was an incredible demonstration of human perseverance against overwhelming odds. These incredible stories show the true power of human bravery. Thanks for watching Aviation's Greatest Rescues. Like, share, and subscribe for more jaw-dropping moments from the skies.